Chapter 22. The king was amused, and in a way impressed that Ida was so determined to win. She was blinded by her own greed, and Caspian wanted nothing more than to see her rotting in prison. He squeezed his hand around Cindy's waist as she shivered in his arms. 4 huntsmen moved toward him. The king needed to act fast. He wasn't worried, but at the same time he couldn't expose his supernatural abilities to the humans standing around. The priest was trying to tell everyone to calm down, while Londus backed further away from the altar, his nose and mouth bleeding. "I'm not losing everything because of you," Ida snapped, still not backing down. "The estate is mine." "You're making a huge mistake," Caspian said, rather tired of all the theatrics. Earlier on he'd wanted her to confess, but now he decided she didn't deserve his mercy. "I doubt that. It's you who's making a mistake." She gestured toward her men to proceed and do her dirty work. Caspian was a vampire, and he had killed many humans, but he was apprehensive to act in front of so many witnesses. He watched the huntsman, who crept toward him, and then leaned over to Cindy. "I love you," he whispered, "and I'm sorry that you have to see this." Caspian hated violence, but he wouldn't mind strengthening himself with human blood. 2 of the huntsmen surrounded him, and using his inhuman speed, he took the knife from the smaller one and began slashing their throats, one by one, before any of them realized what was going on. His instinct had taken over, and the beast inside of him had been awakened. All 4 huntsmen fell to the ground, gasping for breath, as blood flowed from their necks. Many of the guests screamed, others began running away. Panic and complete chaos had taken over the crowd. The king stood by Ida's side a half-second later, breathing hard. His fangs were extended, and he was watching Cindy. He expected to see fear in her eyes, but she appeared relieved instead. Londus was mumbling to himself, staring horrified at Ida's men. The priest was asking God to spare him. Caspian spoke directly into Ida's ear. "I told you that you were making a terrible mistake, but you didn't listen. Now you're going to pay for all of your lies, my lady. You didn't see me hurting these men. They fought with each other over their lost payment. Once you return to Farrington, my guards will take you away to my prison. Soon enough, we'll find your accomplice." Then he looked out over the crowd of wedding guests, repeating the same thing, and using his glamour to make them believe he'd arrived to rescue Cindy. He changed his mind about feeding on the huntsmen, and partially healed their deep cuts. He didn't want to bother with the mess. Besides, his Cindy needed to see that he was still a human deep in his heart. Their love could survive anything, and he wanted to begin on a clean slate. His glamour drifted around, calming everyone and implanting new memories in their minds. As soon as he left with Cindy, people would believe that the wedding hadn't taken place because the bride had changed her mind. The huntsmen stood from the ground and started arguing, blaming each other for their lost payment, just as he'd intended. "What happened? Why are the guests so calm?" Cindy asked, once his glamour had begun to take effect on everyone. He didn't want her to remain there a moment longer. He needed to leave. "Don't worry. Everyone believes you changed your mind. I'm taking you to Farrington. Once we get married, you will become the sole owner of your father's estate," he said. "Unless, of course, your stepmother was right, and you want to marry Londus." Cindy appeared as though she was still in shock. She glanced at her stepsisters and Ida, who were rushing toward the cottage. "No, of course not. I was trapped, but I was never planning to say yes to that idiot," she said, acting as though this was the best day of her life, and Caspian truly hoped for even better days to come. "But in order to take over the estate, I need to have a steady income." "Your art, my dear. You will become an artist and sell your paintings," Caspian stated, knowing this would please her greatly. Cindy had wanted to do this for quite a long time, he knew, and now she could finally fulfill her lifelong dream. He could see the love in her eyes, and his heart warmed instantly. You should have told me your stepmother was blackmailing you. Now, do you want to return to Farrington with me, and at some point become my beloved wife? She stared at him, seeming a bit shocked. Perhaps the king needed to give her some time to gather herself. Yes, take me away from this place, she pleaded, and the king smiled. I don't want to be here a moment longer. He grabbed her hand and lifted her up, seating her upon his horse. Several wedding guests were still watching them. Others were leaving. Caspian jumped back on the horse, wrapped his arms around her, and off they went. Caspian whistled, knowing that his life was finally complete. He had his Cinderella back. Cindy was standing in the king's chamber, staring at her reflection in the huge mirror. Emotions swelled inside of her, but she fought against the tears. She couldn't believe she'd just married a man she truly loved with her whole heart. She never thought she could fall in love again. A few months had passed since Caspian had rescued her from marrying Londus, and Cindy's life had changed dramatically. Her stepmother, Ida, was in prison for treason and fraud. As soon as she'd returned to Farrington, the king's guards arrested her. She screamed and shouted as the guards had taken her away. Caspian told Cindy that Ida didn't deserve any better, and she needed to be taught a harsh lesson. Cindy was relieved that Ida was being punished. She was rotten from the inside out, and had taken advantage of Cindy's good nature for years. Although Cindy realized that she wasn't perfect herself, she was aspiring to become a respected queen. She knew it would take some time to earn the people's trust and help them realize that she wasn't a foolish, reckless young woman anymore. Do something! Speak to the king and tell him to spare Mummy! Susan had begged her several weeks ago when she returned to her father's home. After everything, Cindy decided that Susan and Teresa should stay in her home, knowing they had nowhere else to go. Prison is the best thing that could have happened to her, Susan. You should be thankful, and you should really start thinking of your own reputation, she had replied. Both of her stepsisters glared at her with fire in their eyes when the king kissed her. They didn't dare insult her again, and Cindy hoped that they would truly begin to consider their actions. Then, a few months later, the king proposed to her during dinner, and she'd agreed without hesitation. What are you thinking about, my dear? A voice that sent a shiver racing down her spine brought her back to the present. She needed to stop thinking about the past and just be happy. Londus had been left behind at his farm, and Cindy would never have to see him again. Even Red couldn't believe Cindy had ended up with the king when she'd arrived at her home to hand-deliver an invitation for the wedding. Red had showed up at the wedding ceremony with another man, finally ditching the forest ranger once and for all. Later on, she told Cindy that she was taking her future into her own hands, too. Cindy still remembered how Charles had betrayed her in the tavern, and was silently pleased that things had turned out this way. She had no idea what had happened to him, and didn't care in the least. I'm thinking of how very lucky I am, being here with you, having you in my life, she responded, and Caspian wrapped his strong arms around her. Desire pulled into her stomach, and she felt a sweet pulse between her legs. Caspian had been her constantly since their wedding night. They scarcely left his chamber, but tonight they had another ball to attend. He'd invited several important guests from other kingdoms to celebrate their marriage once again, and they were already late for the party. Cindy had invited Martha and all the girls from the brothel to the wedding. I think I might have a bit of a drinking problem, she'd admitted to Cindy when a handsome stranger had approached her to dance. But I'll get myself together. Fairy dust always helps. Cindy was certain Martha was going to be fine, and she was grateful she'd tripped over her during that night of the ball. Her life would have turned out so much differently otherwise. No, I'm the lucky one, my dear. but I still need blood to survive," Caspian muttered, kissing her neck. She arched her head backward, thinking that perhaps there was something wrong with her hormones. She had a desperate ache between her and she needed to him again. They had just made love, and she'd even allowed him to drink her blood, as she was pumped with desire. The entire act felt much more and pleasurable than she'd ever dared to believe. "How did we get here?" she asked him, attempting to distract herself from the that continued to build in her system. She told herself that she needed to stop analyzing everything for a change. She was finally happy, married to the love of her life, and no one was going to take that away from her. "Well, I haven't been totally honest with you either, my Cinderella. We met earlier on, before you showed up at the ball that I threw for Eric. I'd changed my appearance and became one of the officers who worked with Davies," the Vampire King confessed, and continued, "I witnessed your arrest outside Lord Gerard's home. Even then, you made an impression on me." Cindy's mouth nearly fell to the floor. She turned around to face him, remembering the way she'd felt when he'd looked at her for the first time, and then when they'd rode together. "You were him all this time?" she asked, staring at the man she loved. "But why?" "Davies might be loyal, but people have been saying that he's become greedy. I needed to check for myself if it was true. You stole my heart that night when I learnt you tried to save the girl from being raped, risking your reputation. I was impressed, but I couldn't reveal my true form," he said, and then leaned down to kiss her again. His lips were soft and gentle. The king devoured her like a man starved for intimacy. When he pulled away, she was out of breath, but then he began kissing her. She lost her mind when he was around her. "Well, that explains a lot," she muttered, forgetting about the party and wanting to rip Caspian's clothes off. Her throat was a little sore, but she wanted him to bite her again, or her, or both. Either way, she needed to feel him between again. "Let's stay here. I can't stop kissing you, and I want to cherish your beautiful body," he rasped into her ear, and then pulled down. She giggled and stepped out of it, standing before him. The same she'd forgotten in his chambers when she'd run away after discovering he was a vampire. His eyes gleamed, and she could see scorching desire within their depths, causing a pool of heat to rush to her. She was and ready for him. "Forget about the ball. I need to have you again, Cindy," the Vampire King growled and brought her to his chest. Cindy melted in his arms and knew there was nowhere else she'd rather be. She was in love. She was going to have her happily ever after with a vampire, her own king, who would love her forever. The end.
Chloe's POV. I leaned forward, trying to ease off the stinging pain on my back, but to no avail. Whipped. I had been whipped last night. For what? I didn't have a clue, but I never wanted to experience that again. My own dried tears still stuck to my face. Ever since last night, the pet master had tightened my collar, enough so that it made breathing a challenge. I couldn't breathe quietly even if I wanted to. I didn't know what I did to deserve it. I always tried to do what I was told. Well, when it came to the things that I could control, that is. The rest of the pets and I flinched as the lights in the shop suddenly turned on and the loud boom of the door told us that the pet master was entering. Opening time. The rest of the girls scooted back in their cage as the pet master walked by, some even whimpering in cowardice. I just sat there silently, not wanting the pain to return. My eyes only met his for a brief moment before I looked away in sheer fear. The day went on as normal, vampires coming and going as they pleased. Some left with pets while others took supplies instead. I tried to make myself look smaller than usual today, letting my red, unbrushed hair hang in front of my eyes as I stared at the bottom of my cage, not even daring to look at the vampires that were examining me. The bell rang as a new vampire entered the shop, and for some reason, I decided to see what had just walked in. He was tall. He ran his hand through his seemingly naturally waved back, medium-length black hair as his eyes scanned the shop. His eyes were a deep emerald green, a color that I had rarely seen in the other vampires that come in here. He even had a sharp jawline that nicely framed his face. Yet another vampire that could easily show up any human man.